Thank you, Mike, and thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be in Minnesota and to be visiting St. Olaf for the first time. When the invitation to be part of this conference came, it was not yet clear that the subject of civility would be even more relevant by the day. But of course, that has become obvious during the recent political events of your nation, which we, of course, follow with great interest and fear. So I don't speak on behalf of the Canadian Department of Immigration, but for those of you who are thinking about moving to Canada, I can give you some practical advice after the talk. We don't take just anybody. You may have heard the opposite, but in fact, we're quite selective. So it might do you well to get in with somebody like me. Oops. Oh, you were, okay. Sorry, my title slide is gone, but that is the title. What I wanted to do in this talk, seeing it as a keynote and as a lecture to a public audience, is really survey the terrain concerning the politics of civility. And as Mike mentioned, this has been one of the consistent threads in my academic and popular writing for some decades now. And a variety of arguments are possible in favor of civility. A lot of counter-arguments are also available, and specific objections need to be raised before we can feel confident in defending the value of civility in a political context, even one which is so obviously riven by incivility. In other words, it's not at all clear prima facie that civility is a good thing in politics. And so what I want to do in this talk is review some of the arguments in favor of civility and conclude with what I hope is a renewed sense of urgency with respect to civility in politics. And I'm going to come at this from a variety of angles. So I thought I would start by just giving you an overview of the argument and then unpack it as we go. Now the title will be explained, and I should say that on the sage advice of Dan Hoffring, this is the milder version of the second term. In fact, I will be referencing a book which uses the stronger version of that term. I'm going to tie myself in knots not to use the term, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I will make clear what I see as the important, indeed essential distinction between jerks and asshats, and it turns out to be much more important than you might imagine. This, by the way, is also the subject of the argument made in the introduction to my most recent book, the collection that Mike mentioned called Measure Yourself Against the Earth. So I'll be going at this various ways. Part of it is just to ask yourself the question, what is a jerk? Or more specifically, am I a jerk? So if nothing else, I want you to leave the room after tonight's lecture wondering whether or not you are a jerk. So that's your takeaway moment, and you can just put that in your pocket for later. Here's the overview of the talk. I'm going to start by talking about what we all know all too well, and you'll see what I mean by that in a moment. And then there are 6 substantial sections. The basic issue concerning the nature of the relationship between civility and politics. The distinction between jerks and asshats, which I do think is an important fulcrum for making this argument run. I want to relate the idea of civility to the often confused cognate notion of politeness. Politeness and civility are not the same thing, but there is an important relationship between them. So to make that clear, I'm going to talk about politeness as what the philosopher Grice called conversational implicature, and I'll make clear what that means. And then I'm going to springboard from that to a defense of civility as a political virtue. And then finally, 2 sections where I'm going to attempt to place civility as a political virtue in a broader account of political virtue. Now I should say, so I will do it once and then I'll do it again. I should say just from the outset, it's not at all obvious again, prima facie, that the virtue-based argument in favor of civility is the best one. It's the one that I made first in my research on this topic, but I've come to see that there are perhaps stronger arguments of a negative sort that might do even better work when it comes to this. I don't want, however, to abandon the notion of political virtue, in part because, as I'll explain, it seems to me essential to our self-identity as citizens that we have some kind of virtue-based account of what it means to be political actors, especially under conditions of substantial disagreement on core belief topics. So, what do we all know all too well? Well, this is one thing that we all know all too well. And I was talking to Sarah, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, and I wanted to live my life for at least a week without uttering this man's name. And to the largest extent possible, not hearing it either. And I really think this is almost impossible in current conditions. But I'm not going to, you all know who he is. Why is this significant? Well, Sarah's going to say more about this tomorrow, and I invite you to, because I'm really interested to hear about that. For my purposes, the rise of this person's political popularity is part and parcel of not an apocalyptic vision, decline of American democracy, but rather of the core problem, which is what happens when the norms of rational debate are eroded successfully in political terms. Unsuccessful attempts at erosion are fine, right? We can tolerate those. If our political democracy is robust, we sort of slough them off, they become exceptional or aberrant. But what if it turns out to be successful? And I think this is the one way of putting the struggle that has been going on in the speaking classes of the nation for the past weeks. How do we make sense of this success? I don't think it's unprecedented success, but it is certainly unusual and challenging. So I want to take that seriously. And here's a good example of why it's important. There's Marco Rubio with the famous water bottle. I don't know if people remember the water bottle anymore, but yeah. What happened to Marco Rubio could easily be described as the succumbing to the sucker punch. And what I mean by that is, in order to challenge the previous person, he felt himself compelled to use tactics which he had heretofore not used. And that self-defeated. So in effect, Marco Rubio took himself out of contention by playing by the rules that had been established by somebody else. Classic counterpuncher, the previous person. And what that shows, I think, is a key problem with incivility, which is that it becomes a race to the bottom. A kind of self-defeating tactical arms race where everybody loses in the end. And that's going to turn out to be one of the strongest arguments in favor of incivility, a negative argument. Now, at the moment, this is my fellow countryman, we're very proud of him. No, we're really not. But at the moment, it is almost unbelievable if you follow this, and I'm sure you do, what's happened even in the past 7 days. Who would have thought that two allegedly serious candidates for high office would be trading schoolyard insults about each other's spouses? And defense, the offered defense would be something like, he started it, you know, which never worked when we were kids and shouldn't work when we're running for high office. So this is what we all know all too well. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the diagnostics, but you can easily see the relationship between these things and certain other well-known cultural factors, like this. The endless possibilities of disagreement and often anonymous and ill-mannered that have been made possible by currently dominant forms of communication. Cultural things, like the culture of trash talking in sports, which spills over into other elements of democratic culture. I wanted to show this important counterexample. You may know that Andrew Luck has a kind of reverse psychology tactic that he uses. Instead of trash talking, he does what he calls, you know, I think he calls it pretty talking. So when somebody hits him really hard, he says, you know, that was a really nice hit. And this kind of gets under the skin of people who are used to being trash talked to all the time. So that's a nice counterexample. But a celebrity culture where there is a host of staged events of kind of dramatic animosity, which nobody can really tell whether they're real or not. That's Kanye and Taylor Swift. But also the background condition of self-absorption, which is much remarked and much lamented in our culture. And I'm not going to pause to try to demonstrate this. I'm merely going to assert it for now. I think we are becoming much more isolated in our own sense of self-regard as a broad trend in the past, say, half century. And this makes it harder and harder for us to feel like there are duties owing to others. And I went through the airport this morning in Toronto, and in the security line, this is a very typical experience. The security line is the new state of nature. It's every person for himself. It's the war of all against all. But it's sort of ridiculous, because if you take a step back, and if you're like me, you leave enough time to not get stressed in the security line, you realize everybody wants the same thing, right? Everybody wants to get through security quickly. But the more you struggle, there was a shortage of bins in my security line. So people were fighting over bins to put their laptops in. It's like, that's not going to help anybody. You're spending all of your time fighting over the bin, when if you just let somebody else take the bin, I'm sure there's another bin coming to put your stuff in. But the kind of self-absorption or self-regard which takes over people when they have their focus narrowly on personal goals does erode a sense of commonality and a sense of commitment to the other. And this, I want to argue, is ultimately self-defeating. There is also, it seems to me, I don't know how many people follow House of Cards, watched House of Cards? Fair number, yeah. It's fascinating because some people are saying, well, Trump, there I said his name, Trump is the Frank Underwood of contemporary real world politics, but in fact, not even close. If only we had somebody like Frank Underwood, who, sociopathic, Machiavellian, murderer, serial deceiver that he is, at least makes sense. His motives actually make sense, and his relationship between desire and action is perfectly perspicuous, right? And he gives speeches that are absolutely deceitful, but they're not incoherent. And I think that people often say, "Oh, wouldn't it be awful to live in the fictional world of House of Cards?" And I say, no, bring it on, because at least you know where you are with somebody who is a liar. And this is an important distinction. A liar is not the same thing as a bullshit artist. My colleague Harry Frankfurt has made this argument. A bullshit artist is somebody who has no regard for the norm of truth. A liar is someone who is subverting the norm of truth. And this is an important distinction, because the subverter of the norm of truth actually is still beholden to that, still believes that there is a difference between appearance and reality, between deception and truth. Somebody who is completely immersed in their own bullshit actually can no longer tell the difference between truth and its other. Right? And that is really an important difference. So we are living in a world not of deceit, but of bullshit. And that is what we know all too well. Now, what are the responses to this? Again, the very optimistic thing would be a series of imperatives. And I just chose this is a poster that can be found on college campuses, which has all kinds of nice imperatives on it. But these imperatives by themselves are hollow. And they become, as you can see here, mere slogans. These are all important things, but just in the form of slogans, they have no real traction. And when it comes to the specific virtue of civility, you get this kind of thing. You get choose civility in a kind of flowery, as if civility is a sort of Downton Abbey kind of comportment issue. Make sure that you pick up your teacup with your pinky outstretched or whatever. Or you get this, which is even more pathetic in a way. It's like, yeah, I'm a civility groupie, and I just don't think you're gonna win this argument by trying to make civility cool any more than you're gonna win the argument by trying to make it look like a matter of comportment. So, what can we do with this background in play? Well, here's the basic issue, and I quote a famous passage that some of you may know from Schopenhauer's Per erga and per lepomena, and this is the only block quote in my presentation, but I'll just, instead of reading it out, because I hate when people do that, I'm just going to pause and take a drink of water, and you can all read it yourselves. Now, I want to emphasize here something that I'm going to disagree with in the translation that's offered here and in most translations from Schopenhauer's German. The German phrase is feine Sitte, which does mean actually good manners or politeness. But I want to read this by substituting for that civility. And what I think of as the porcupine's dilemma is this question of appropriate distance. So the theme of our conference is disagreement. The question is not, do we disagree? Of course we do. The question is, how are we going to go about disagreeing? And the idea of the porcupines also gives a sense that it's not merely a matter of managing disagreement, it's also a matter of managing the things that we want from each other. Because in the parable or in the example, the porcupines need each other for warmth, but they can't maximize that without the cost of pain. And so this kind of reflective equilibrium that they manage to find, the distance, to keep your distance, really is a creative, pragmatic solution to the two prongs of the problem. First prong is we want to be together. There are things we need from each other that we can't get any other way. The second prong is the closer we come to each other, the more we realize that it can be prickly. And so finding this, managing this, is really, it seems to me, the essence of democratic political life. There are many other metaphors for this problem, but I really like this porcupine one because I think it emphasizes just how delicate the matter is in finding the proper distance. So, how do we live together with disagreement? Now, various kinds of answers have been offered. One way of understanding civility in this context is a matter of self-restraint. So not saying or not condemning all that we might. And indeed, many kinds of accounts of civility parse it this way. I may think that what you've said is abhorrent or stupid, but I'm not going to say so because that serves no useful purpose. And there's something to this, of course, that matter of self-restraint can actually do a fair bit of work, but it seems to me that it puts far too much emphasis on stifling oneself in the service of something which is not obviously giving me the things that I want. And I want to try to find a more creative version of this finding the distance than merely self-restraint. Professor Langerak's wonderful work on perspectival pluralism gives us a much richer account of what it means to find our distance with respect to others with whom we disagree. And the subtlety of his arguments, I'm sure many of you here know them, is precisely to think beyond merely suppressing oneself, but to cultivate a sense of what is plausible in respect of what others are also up to. And I won't go into more detail, he can do that himself. But what is convincing in this account, it seems to me, is how it takes regard of the moral and psychological complexity of individuals in respect of their own beliefs and in respect of how those beliefs come up against the beliefs of others. So we can enrich the account beyond self-restraint and start taking up a pluralist perspective, which allows us to act in concert with each other, even though we may disagree. But here's a problem, and there are a number of problems, but here's one I'm going to focus on. This kind of account starts to lean very hard on the nature of good argument. And of course, that's as it should be coming from a philosopher. But we have to ask the real world tough question, what if we don't know what counts as a good argument, or we don't agree about that? And what if, moreover, there are those people who simply don't care that some arguments are better than others? And you might think, well, that's sort of the game ender. If you are not caring about the nature of argument or good arguments versus bad ones, then there's nothing further to be said. Well, unfortunately, that's what politics are like in democratic societies. There are lots of people who simply don't care that a stronger argument has been advanced in front of them. And this is why the nuances of, say, Habermas's discourse ethics come up against real-world curbs. The unforced force of the better argument is often not motive in real democratic politics. So I want to just say that as a kind of cautionary problem for any reason-based account. We have to go beyond that if we're going to defend the nature of robust political discourse in the real world. So these two, well, they don't know what argument is, or maybe they do, but So, how are we going to go about adding some further complexity and, I hope, convincingness to the account of civility? Well, let's start with this distinction between jerks and asshats. The account of jerks that I'm drawing on here was offered by Eric Schwitzgebel, and what's significant about Schwitzgebel's notion of the jerk is that, as I suggested earlier, anybody can be a jerk. And really, the nature of being a jerk is at least dyadic with respect to another, and often much more complex than that, which is to say, one is not simply a jerk, one is a jerk to somebody else. And being a jerk is most often, in Schwitzgebel's account, a function of perceived relative superiority, often temporary, but nevertheless present. So that I'm a jerk, for example, if I behave a certain way in a restaurant to the waitstaff, because at that moment I'm the customer and they are the staff, and I allow myself to engage in bad behavior because of that structural relationship between us. Whereas if the roles were reversed, or if I met that person in another context, the jerkiness would not be present, at least one hopes. What this means is that when we think about the nature of being a jerk, it is always contextualized by our social relations. This in distinction, importantly, I think, jerks, to asshats. And Aaron James's work, and I guess I can say it since I'm quoting his book called Assholes, A Theory. In that book, James explores the nature of that condition, which he argues, I think correctly, is much more static and reified than the condition of being a jerk. And what that means in simple terms is, think about the fact that being an asshole, an asshat, is something that you always are. Because in contrast to the jerk, where your superiority is perceived, relative, and possibly temporary, when you are an asshat, your perceived superiority is constant. Moreover, it is a characteristic of the asshat that the perceived superiority is woven into the identity and sense of entitlement of the individual, which may not be true in the case of the jerk. So this is important because what the asshat suffers from is excessive entitlement disorder. It is actually a condition of mind, you might even say of spirit or being in the world, where the perceived authority is comprehensive and constant. And we can characterize this, I mean, the standard phrase to describe this condition is the person who was born on third base and thought they hit a triple. Right? So that's important because, I mean, it was said about George W. Bush, for example, born on third base, thought he hit a triple. Why? Because the sense of perceived authority is thought to be earned. That's part of what makes it constant and comprehensive, even though those of us who can take a step back from being in that condition realize that the perceived authority is based on highly contingent circumstances, like birthright, birth order, birthplace, parents, and so on. Right? And this is why the bonds of the asshat are much harder to shake than that of the jerk, because it's woven into the sense of the person, but also is perceived as being merited. And that's why it's more reified and persistent. Now, once we have this idea of the distinction in mind, we can start to do some political work with it. One way of thinking about it is, here I'm referencing Raymond Geuss, a political theorist. Think about the notion of generalized nemesis. This is Geuss's idea. There's Nemesis, the goddess of affliction or enemy. Right? What if we generalized the idea of nemesis? Right? Not that everybody is afflicted, but that everybody shares, in a sense, a vulnerability to affliction. And here we can start to see, not by optimistic attempts to pair bond with others, but just to recognize in oneself the force of contingency. And this may actually do some political work, because if I start to think, rather than I was born on third base, but I hit a triple, instead I think, actually, oh, I was born on third base, I didn't do anything to do that. Right? I don't deserve it, it just happened. That in itself is an important conceptual step, because we now can start to chip away at the sense of entitlement that is associated with the asshat condition. So that's Geuss's idea of generalized nemesis. We can also invoke very old-fashioned political notions like fairness. And I'm going to speak about fairness again in a few moments, but the notion of fairness really is primal to our sense of political obligation. And you can find it in specific political theoretical texts like Rawls's theory of justice, for example, but you even find it in Freud's account of the evolution of the psyche in civilization and its discontents. The first justice claim in the psyche, according to Freud, is the very same one that we experience in families. Why does the sibling get something that I don't get? Or if you're a soul child, why does another child get something that I don't get? That claim, or that it really is a cry, is the essence of the notion of fairness. And our intuitions about fairness are really primal with respect to this. So you can do, Rawls was absolutely correct about this, you can do a lot of sophisticated theoretical work based on, driven by, intuitions about the nature of fairness. Now, here's one suggestion before I leave this topic, and to try to illustrate why the jerk might be the thing that you want to be. You don't want to be an asshat, or at least what you want to be is an asshat who's willing to move from that condition to being merely a jerk. And for those of us who are only jerks now and then, we want to move from being jerks sometimes to being jerks maybe never. But here's one way to think about this. The problem with jerkiness, even in the best intentioned of individuals, is that we can't always see it. Clearly, in the asshat condition, that person can't see it. Right? The sense of entitlement is too strong. But even when we're in the jerk condition, part of what allows us to act in jerky ways is because we feel justified in doing so. But our perspective is often warped. So here's an old idea. This comes from Bertrand Russell, what he called emotional conjugation. And you can illustrate this with some examples that help us to see what I mean by the jerk within. So here are some examples. I'm firm, you're obstinate, he's a pig-headed fool. And what does this illustrate? Well, the first-person perspective is the most forgiving, obviously. So I see a certain kind of character trait or action as being something positive. Right? I'm firm. The very same behavior or character trait in you is something that I find irritating. So I don't give you credit for it. It's slightly disreputable. And then, as it were, I and you gang up on some nameless third person, he, him, and the very same character trait or action is now seen as positively vicious, as pig-headed. Right? So other examples of the same kind. I'm righteously indignant. You're annoyed. He's making a fuss over nothing. Right? And you can even see already in that example the essence of a jerky behavior. Someone who works themselves up into a condition of righteous indignation over something which, if they were able to see themselves from a third-person perspective, in a third-person perspective, would realize is a fuss over nothing. I've reconsidered the matter. You've changed your mind. He's gone back on his word. Right? So again, we're talking in each case about the very same trait or action, but the conjugation has to do with the relative distance to the ego position. And finally, in these examples, I have an independent mind, you're eccentric, and he's around the twist. Right? So my independence of mind is something that I value. When I see the very same actions or traits in another, I think that person is mad. Right? And then the you is the in-between. So the jerk within, I think, is something that is ever threatening in our sense of how civility relates to politics. Of course, it's not the only threat to civility in politics, as I've already suggested. To try to put some meat on these bones now, let me plot the relationship between politeness and civility. As I said earlier, often confused, often conflated, politeness really is forms usually of self-restraint or of smoothness of interaction. It's not without value, but it seems to me it's a mistake to see that as identical with civility or even of essence with respect to civility. And that's why, for example, I think significantly, you can engage in lots of impolite speech, which is nevertheless civil in the sense that I'm going to defend. Because civility, it will turn out, is much more about continuing the discursive game than it is about any particular speech act being itself polite. Now, to see this, I'm going to just briefly give you a sketch of Grice's notion of implicature. What Grice wanted to do was move from the semantics of language to the pragmatics of language. So it's rooted really in how we do things with words, speech act theory of various kinds, and in particular, the way we do things with words to imply things without actually saying them. So that's the notion of conversational implicature. I'm implying things using conversation. And what Grice argued was there's a basic maxim that governs most conversational interactions, just as a matter of empirical fact. He called it the cooperative principle. And it is that when there is nothing else at stake, so when there's no obvious competition in a conversational game, most of us naturally cooperate. There is no reason for us not to in non-competitive games. And there are even some competitive games in which we cooperate, but in non-competitive conversational games, there's really no reason for us not to cooperate. And by cooperate, what do we mean? Well, Grice gave us 4 maxims of cooperation under this principle. They are the maxim of quality, be truthful; the maxim of quantity, be adequately informative, say enough to make sense, but not more than you need to; the maxim of relation, be relevant. Right? Say the things that are relevant to what's going on in the conversation. Don't introduce irrelevancies without reason. And finally, the maxim of manner, be clear. Now, the interesting thing is that any one of these 4 maxims can be flouted in the name of politeness. And to give you an example of this, so the important point here is that under the sign of politeness, I might say things which are not cooperative on the surface because they flout one of the maxims, but which actually serve the higher purpose of keeping the conversation going. So here's an example. Polite flouting of the cooperative principle. Don says, "How do you like my suit?" And Ron says, "It's so brave, it's so you." And I chose this example because I wanted to show you another of my countrymen. It's Don Cherry there in the suit, and that's Ron McLean from Hockey Night in Canada, Don Cherry's coach's corner. Don Cherry has a propensity for wearing these outrageous suits. If somebody, not Don Cherry, but somebody who came to you and said, "What do you think of my suit?" and you actually hated it, it might be very good manners to say, "It's so brave, it's so you." Now, you are flouting a couple of the maxims of the cooperative principle there. Right? You're saying something which is not directly relevant. You're not answering the question. You're not being untruthful. And you're not saying something that is in excess of what's needed, but you are, as it were, going around the question. Right? By the same token, consistent with Grice's implicature, you can have impolite non-flouting of the cooperative principle. So here's a good example of that. Homer says, "I just don't want you to lose respect for me, son." And Bart says, "Homer, I have as much respect for you now as I ever did." Which absolutely satisfies all 4 maxims of the cooperative principle, but the implicature is clear. So in both cases, what Grice is showing us here, in the move from semantics to pragmatics, we can do things with words in quite subtle ways. If people are sensitive to the implicature, they might pick up on the things that we're saying. But in the case of the polite flouting of the cooperative principle, one of the things we're doing is not forcing the issue. So we're allowing the pragmatic goal of continuing our conversation to be guided by a kind of semantic sleight of hand. And likewise, with the impolite non-flouting of the cooperative principle, the semantic sleight of hand there is saying something truthful, apparently relevant, clear, and so on, which nevertheless carries an implicature. Maybe it's one only I hear, and I get a kind of secret joke enjoyment out of doing that, but can also be picked up by somebody else. So that's politeness as implicature. And what's important about it, for my purposes, is that relationship between semantics and pragmatics. That we can, in fact, almost always are doing things with words. And the subtleties of that can actually be managed to larger effect, depending on what our conversational goals are. Now, if we move from politeness to civility, we have to complicate the picture somewhat. We have to move from semantics to pragmatics to politics. And now we have to have more maxims in play. So we have the cooperative principle still in play, baseline, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, cooperate. Right? But we have to add what I call the civility meta-maxim, which we can define this way. Ceteris paribus, work with the other persons for the sake of the game's continuance. Now that may sound obvious, but it's not. Because what we're going to see is that there are lots of ways of not meeting the demands of the civility meta-maxim in conversation. And if we see this, however, as a more of a baseline, right, that the game's continuance is a goal larger than my particular goals in the conversation, even in competitive games, right? There is no game, competitive or otherwise, unless the game continues. The game's continuance is actually our first duty as semantic interlocutors. And if we can see that more clearly, then we might be on our way to a more robust notion of civility. So what would that look like in practice? Well, very traditional ideas, dialogic respect for persons. Other persons are players in the game. And if I want the game to continue, I have to allow them to also play the game. We also have to have some notion of the rational presuppositions of the discourse itself. I don't think, as I said before, you can put all your money in this basket. Right? I don't think you can actually use the notion of rational presuppositions in the Habermasian way to drive the conclusion. But you can advert to the rational presuppositions of the game as part of the game's continuance. That's the thing that keeps us going. And now we have to confront some objections. Does this operate even in competitive games? Well, possibly. It's obvious, it seems to me, that it operates in cooperative or non-competitive games, or there's no reason why it shouldn't, just like there's no reason why Grice's original CP can't be a baseline commitment. But in competitive games, does it operate? Well, I think it does, because it seems to me, if we think about the nature of competitive games, we see that the whole point of the competitive game is to constrain our engagements. That's really what competitive games are. Competitive games aren't free-for-alls. They are normatively guided forms of interaction. Now, they might have winners and losers, and you can have a game that drives to a conclusion, and we take great interest and pleasure in that kind of game, a finite game, to use Kars's distinction. But we also want games that open up new possibilities. And in fact, when it comes to the game of political discourse, democratic political discourse, what I think we have is a combination of infinite and finite games. We have finite games localized. There are particular winners and losers. Somebody's going to win the election in November. Somebody's going to win the nomination for each of the two parties. And that means that others will lose. It's a zero-sum solution. But the whole point of that particular localized finite game with a winner and a loser is that the larger game can continue. And what's the larger game? Well, the larger game is democratic politics. So you can win a debate, but that doesn't mean you win discourse. Rather, it means that you depend upon the continuation of discourse for there to be a winner at all. And again, once we see this more clearly, I think we can incorporate certain aspects of our real-world experience of politics without losing this larger sense of a commitment to discourse more generally. So, first objection, does it operate even in competitive games? I think the answer is yes, if we see the competitive game as only part of a larger, non-competitive continuing game. And the second objection, what about cheats and spoil sports? And here I use a distinction from Johann Huizinga in Homo Ludens. What's the difference between a cheat and a spoil sport? Well, the main difference is that the larger game of democratic politics can tolerate cheats, but it can't really tolerate spoil sports. And what's the difference? Well, a cheat is like a liar. A cheat is somebody who is flouting the rules. And any sufficiently robust game can support a certain amount of cheating. We might not like it, and we might punish it if we find it out, but we can tolerate it. Just like a post-secondary institution can tolerate a certain amount of plagiarism. We might try to root it out, but we might also recognize that there are cases that happen that we simply don't catch. And that's, kind of okay. It's not great, but it's tolerable. Because the cheater, in some important sense, cheats only himself or herself. So cheaters get away with micro advantages, but they only do so because their cheating actually reinforces the success of the game overall. You can't cheat successfully unless there is something to cheat against. So every time you win at cheating, in effect, you are reinforcing the normativity of the thing that you are cheating against, just like the liar is reinforcing the normativity of truth. But by contrast, the spoilsport is somebody who is like the bullshit artist, somebody who is actually stopping the game. And that can happen in interesting ways as well as bad ones. The one I chose here is a deliberately difficult example, Bartleby the Scrivener, who in Melville's famous story is the person who says, I would prefer not to. Have people read Bartleby the Scrivener? Some people? Yeah. What's great about this story of Melville is that Bartleby becomes a kind of indigestible aspect of human relations. He won't do or act the way he's supposed to. And he gradually stops doing the scrivening, which is copying legal documents. He gradually stops eating. He stops moving. He stops talking, except to utter this deathless phrase, I would prefer not to. He doesn't say always what he would prefer not to do. It's simply that he would prefer not to. And the narrator of the story, who is a master of chancery law, finds this a kind of existential threat to his own sense of how things make sense. And so Bartleby's a spoilsport in the game of human relations. He is making it impossible for us to place him as a player. And that's an important notion of what the spoilsport is, someone who simply will not go along with the game's continuance. Bartleby, by the way, has been hailed as everything from a revolutionary Dada neo-situationist to a kind of spokesperson for the silent majority to anything in between. And it's part of Melville's genius that we can't really say firmly Bartleby is this or represents that. That's part of what the spoilsport does. Right? So the I would prefer not to is a kind of polysemous signifier. It has infinite possibilities of meaning, and that's what stops the game. Now, I think that is a significant possibility, but for the most part, we don't want spoilsports. Right? You might want to be one if you existentially fed up with the world of democratic politics, but what we want and what we count on other people to be is not spoilsports, but players. And maybe they cheat now and then, but that's okay, as long as they play. So, third objection, an important one, maybe even more important than the first two, civility stifles dissent. And I'm sure you've heard various versions of this. Even to talk about this notion of civility as the game's continuance is always already to invoke some notion of how things ought to look, how discourse should sound, what kind of language should be used. And this objection can be inflected various ways. Is the language of civil discourse racially biased? Is it class biased? Is it education biased? Do people with larger vocabularies have an unfair advantage in discursive practices? Those who have been trained or socialized into the norms of accepted behavior, did they have an advantage? Right? These are an important set of objections. And I want to acknowledge those, but also push back a little and say, if we focus not on the particulars of discursive style, but on the very idea of the game's continuance, we can potentially meet the force of this objection. And we do that precisely by taking the objection seriously as itself a discursive challenge. So if someone says civility is inherently biased this way or that way, then the proper response is not to deny it or to silence that dissent, but instead to take seriously that dissent as a move in the discursive game, because that's exactly what it is. Unless, and that is, it is always a possibility, unless the objection really is a spoilsport objection, which is intended to shut down the discourse, in which case we really are going to be at loggerheads. So I don't have to rehearse these controversies for you probably, but in the past year on various college campuses and elsewhere, we had heated debate about the nature of free speech, the nature of speech generally, of privilege, of the nature of where and how people speak. And all of this, it seems to me, is part of the push that Objection 3 is putting on the notion of civility. That's important and essential. Again, I think we can meet that challenge by taking seriously the idea that what civility means is not how you style your speech, but the fact that the game of speech continues. And then finally, of this cluster of objections, a common objection: talk solves nothing. Action is everything. Well, you know, this objection, I think, is one that holds water only with people who haven't been paying attention to the nature of politics, because politics is talk. It is lots of refined and unrefined talk. It is talk in the form of policy and bills and laws. But politics is an inherently discursive practice. And the idea that talk solves nothing is itself a discursive move, like all these objections. And again, simply reinforces, to my mind, the nature of the problem, which is how do we keep the game going? I want to highlight, though, two specific versions of this objection, which I think maybe are especially relevant now. Let me put it that way. The first is the influence of money as talk. Since the Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court of this country has ruled that money is a form of speech. That is somewhat astonishing in the metaphysical universe, but nevertheless, the Supreme Court has the metaphysical power to change one kind of thing into another kind of thing, and we have to bow down before that power, or at least you do. I get to go home to Canada. But the idea that money is speech, of course, is a key factor in the nature of real-world politics in this country and elsewhere. The moneyed interest becomes overwhelming. And because money is such that it's fungible and accumulatable, power of speech can be force amplified under these conditions. When the only agents of speech are individuals, even conglomerations of individuals are limited by the number of people that they can bring together to multiply their force. So unions, political action committees, interest groups were inherently limited by the principle of equality of individuals. Citizens United actually obliterates that principle because it says that an individual or small group of individuals can potentially infinitely multiply the force of their speech through money. And there's nothing to curb this within the decision's logic. So this is still underappreciated as a sea change in the nature of political reality in the United States. That force multiplier is actually contrary to the logic of individual equality because of the nature of money. So, you know, money's always had that nature. It's what Locke worried about when currency was introduced into the natural condition of humankind. It can be pooled. I can have more money than you through various means. I can be born into more money than you through various contingencies. But when we understand, as the court does, that money is speech, then we have actually created a potential subversion of the very idea of democratic equality. And I don't think it is any starker than that, but it has to be appreciated as that. So that's an important version. It's not so much that talk solves nothing as talk is devalued under these current conditions of money as speech. And the second version of this that I think we need to take more seriously under current circumstances is what, for lack of a better phrase, we have to call the influence of crazy. That there is a whole lot of crazy in politics. And when people are prepared to be crazy, then they put us all at a disadvantage if we are going along thinking that we ought to be rational. Now, sometimes the crazy person is just another cheat. They get a micro advantage which the larger game can tolerate. But as I suggested before with Mr. Trump, there are certain kinds of crazy, when thoroughly successful, that actually turn out to be corrosive of the game, even though the game appears to be continuing. Right? Mr. Trump is not a spoilsport in the sense that Bartleby is. He's not taking himself out or stopping the game. He is actually subverting the game according to norms of non-rational success. And this actually becomes a serious existential threat to the game. So what happens is, so this is a Rolling Stone illustration of the, back when there were many more faces in the race, but nevertheless, as we've seen in the past months, really just 2 or 3 months, the domination of crazy over rational has been working. I get the sense that there is some kind of change coming. There's a sense of reassertion of civil discourse against the crazy factor, and let's hope that is robust enough to carry the day. But I think we teeter on the brink right now. And of course, what that means is, weirdly enough, for those of us who are not crazy, it can start to make us feel crazy, right? And that's the sort of knock-on effect. So, when the Will Ferrell character is the only one who sees that Derek Zoolander really only has one look, even though they all have different names, Blue Steel, and right? And he says, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills because no one else can see that. Well, that's how you might feel if you're a rational person watching contemporary democratic politics, because you start to doubt your own sanity when your rationality is coming up against the success of crazy. Right? And then crazy becomes a kind of epidemic. Right? Who's crazy? Is the person who's succeeding crazy, or is my judgment that he's crazy making me feel crazy because everyone else seems to go along as if nothing crazy is happening, and that's what makes you wake up in the middle of the night and wish you were somewhere else. All right, now to conclude this, 2 attempts now to place the notion of civility as the game's continuance within a larger virtue-based account of democratic citizenship. And I think we can start by noticing the negative argument that I mentioned earlier. Incivility is a form of collective action problem, which is to say it is akin to things like races to the bottom, prisoners' dilemmas, competitive consumption, and so on, tragedies of the commons. Just to give you a version of collective action problems that's familiar, that's a graphic representation of the tragedy of the commons. Since there won't be a test later, don't worry about it, but that's what it looks like. The tragedy of the commons is classic Garrett Hardin article. When everybody pursues their individual rational interest to graze on common land, everybody loses, because the rational interest to graze on common land gives me an incentive to graze more animals, but it gives everyone else the very same incentive to graze more animals. And the more animals that graze eventually destroy the common land. So a thing that's held in common, which could benefit everybody to their individual interests, if their individual interest is allowed to run away, each individual pursuing that interest actually self-defeats everybody, including that individual. Right? The common is destroyed, and nobody gets to graze any animals. Now, many versions of collective action problems have that quality. The other most common one is the prisoner's dilemma, where I'm given a choice to either cooperate or defect in respect of my partner in crime. And if I pursue my individual interests and the other person does too, we both lose. If I try to cooperate, I might win marginally, but if the other person decides not to cooperate, then I lose big time and he wins. Right? So the prisoner's dilemma is really a kind of micro version of the conflict between 2 rational interests that we see in the tragedy of the commons. And what this really says in the case of civility, to go back to the Trump-Rubio example, you do gain, potentially, an advantage by being uncivil. You can win an argument by being rude. You can get to the head of the line by being rude. You can get better service by being rude, and so on. But all that does, globally speaking, is give everyone else an incentive to do the same thing, because they see that pursuing their rational self-interest means pursuing that same advantage. But if everybody does do that, it's a way to the races. So if I'm uncivil and you answer with incivility, then I now have a renewed extra incentive to be even more uncivil back, and then you do, and then I do, and then you do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So this is actually a strong negative argument in favor of civility, that incivility is self-defeating, because it destroys discourse, ultimately. In pursuit of small temporary advantage, we end up all losing, including the people who got the advantage in the first instance. Sorry, go back. Rational self-interest, however, has to be acknowledged as part of the democratic political picture. What I want to suggest is rational and self-interest actually isn't just two ways of saying the same thing, but the rational part of self-interest should carry a normative weight of curbing one's own desires. Partly, this is just good for you. You shouldn't let your desires run rampant, but is also, more importantly, recognition of the looming self-defeats of unfettered self-interest. It's in my self-interest for my self-interest not to run amok. Because if that is the case, we avoid the self-defeats that would destroy all of our interests. So, and the consumption fulfillment curve is a good example of this. I realize, even in my own desires, that certain things will generate satisfactions up to a point of marginal utility, after which there is actually negative utility on the curve. I don't get more advantage out of pursuing a desire. And this, by the way, doesn't even yet take into account the issue of multiple interests or desires being in play. This is just within the individual, him or herself, rational self-interest reaches a marginal utility, negative utility tipping point. What other virtues can we talk about? Well, reasonableness, and by reasonableness I mean something like this, right? Which again is sort of a topic of the moment. Reasonableness is realizing that you're not the only player in the game, and that the game is the game only because there are other players. It also means not just check your privilege, but that you may turn out to be a loser in some finite micro versions of the game. You don't get to win every election or every debate. And being reasonable is the virtue of accepting that as part of the bargain of the larger game's continuance. Fairness, to go back to that, again, fairness is really, now in my terms, a matter of not being a jerk. Because what you realize in the nature of fairness is that whatever apparent perceived superiority you might feel really is temporary and relational, and probably based on your ego position. And fairness reminds you that everybody else has their own ego position too. You are the I, she is the you, he is the him, but that is only about the position that you hold. And that position is a contingent fact of the game. So don't be a jerk is really a matter of taking account of the fragility of your position within this ego construction as part of the democratic game. Appropriate suspicion is a virtue of democratic citizens, not this suspicion. Cary Grant, Joan Fontaine, great movie. But the suspicion that we legitimately hold with respect to other people and especially to the institutions and officers of government, the state, in short. It's appropriate for democratic citizens to be suspicious of the state. Not because they want to undermine the state, but precisely because they want the state to be legitimate. And the only legitimacy the state can have is if it passes muster with our suspicions about the ulterior motives or the institutional biases that the state might begin to exhibit. Civility, now, we can place within this scheme as openness to the other. Right? The idea that the other is another player in the game. And it's not about style, and it's certainly not about politeness. It is about your comportment with respect to the other as another player in the game as you are. And that in some extremely important sense, we're all in this together. The other may be somebody that you find very alien. And I think this is something that we have to embrace, that the notion of otherness is constantly changing. So you might think, well, I just got used to others like, say, gays, but now I'm going to be dealing with people who are transgender, and I have to reorder my expectations about otherness with respect to things like signage on bathrooms. Right? That wasn't an issue 5 years ago, but it is an issue now. Civility, in my sense, means to be open precisely to those kinds of challenges because they are the essence of the democratic discursive game. And then finally, as this list of very traditional virtues, justice, and I could say a lot more about this, but time is pressing. Participation in the game is part of what justice demands. You are, in some important sense, not allowed to be a spoilsport. A lot of people would like to take themselves out of the game. They don't see why they shouldn't be allowed to go about their business and not be part of the political game of discursive justification. Justice demands that that not be allowed to be the case, that we not allow people to, or ourselves, to rest easy as opters out or spoilsports. It also means, maybe more actively, opposing injustice wherever it's perceived. So the classic example of this is, it's a failure of citizenship to watch an injustice being perpetrated and do nothing about it because it doesn't directly concern you. Because it actually indirectly does concern you. Every injustice, however trivial, is actually a threat to the robustness of the democratic political game. So justice, I couldn't resist that, but it's not that kind of justice, but it's such a great image and it looks great on the screen, so there you go. Under these conditions then, we could reframe citizenship as not just having these virtues as character traits, but actually as a discursive engagement. That's what it means to be a good citizen. It means to be engaged with our fellow citizens in a series of discursive interplays. And it might be the case, surprisingly, that though we started with disagreement, we might find that in order to disagree, we actually have to agree on a very great deal. And that really is the nature of discourse. Right? To even frame disagreements in a coherent way, as opposed to descending into incoherence or bullshit, we actually have to agree on a very great deal. And once we see that, we can actually build on that. Again, I don't think Habermas's presuppositions of rationality do the work here, or all the work, but that notion of underlying agreement, which makes disagreement possible, is an important part of what we understand discourse to be. In addition to that, citizenship as discursive engagement is what I like to think of as sympathy as the moral value of public life. And this is a very old idea associated, among other places, with Adam Smith. Sometimes people say, well, you don't mean sympathy, you mean empathy. We can debate that in the Q&A if you want. Smith said sympathy, that was the word he used. And what he meant was recognizing through my exercise of imagination the existence of the other as somebody like me. Somebody with the same complexes of desires and potential for suffering, same vulnerabilities. And without that exercise of imagination, none of the rest of this will work. So you can place emphasis on various parts of this. I want to see this as a kind of whole that's knit together and underwritten by both rational commitments and this imaginative ability, willingness to see the other as vulnerable as I am. Now, we could then say, I think, I'm going to be a little bit tentative about this, philosophy is civility in the important sense that philosophy, broadly construed, is the mental discipline, whether it's a subject in college or not, is the mental discipline of seeing the other as like me and being open to argument. So civility, philosophy as civility, rooted in a sense of my sense of vulnerability, right? And knowing that I can recognize in the other, even though I don't experience it directly, a similar sense of vulnerability, right? The famous Clinton mantra was, I feel your pain. Nobody feels anybody else's pain. It's not possible. But what we can feel is pain at the pain of others. And that's really, I think, what Smith means by sympathy. Right? It's that vicarious pain, the recognition through imagination of the suffering as something that the other is experiencing. And it's rooted in our own sense of vulnerability. It seems to me it's very, very basic and existential. And then I think we can make a further claim, philosophy as civility, as justice. Because if we engage each other in this manner, we are actually going to be creating not just a vibrant conversation. It's not just, discourse is great. We're actually going to be creating a just democratic society through our engagements, discursive, imaginative, participatory, disagreeing, and so on. Now, let me conclude by saying this is a very optimistic picture, obviously, and I don't want to leave without canvassing some of the problems that we have to face. The world is changing much faster than we imagine, and the kinds of otherness that we are going to encounter are literally unimaginable. The exercise of imagination is something which has limits. But when we are confronted with otherness, a previously exercised imagination is going to be more able to meet new challenges than one that is not exercised. So this is an important example. It seems to me people are talking a lot lately about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity really is the idea that just as in any case with human actions or behaviors, there's a spectrum, a distribution of things that are considered normal and not normal. And more, the other is not going to be somebody who has, say, a different skin color or different genitals or a different way of comporting themselves with respect to identity, but somebody who is actually thinking a different way, who is minded otherwise than most of us. So the particular cases that are at issue for neurodiversity, people who are autistic or who have Asperger's conditions, people who are not normal in the statistical sense, but who have gifts for the rest of us, just like everybody who's other has gifts for the rest of us. And the openness that we might demonstrate with respect to this challenge is a democratic test of our citizenship. And there'll be future ones. Right? There may be forms of diversity which we haven't yet encountered, and we can't even, like I said, we can't even imagine them. What if there are non-human entities that call forth our democratic sympathies? If you believe in the singularity, as I do, I don't think it's a matter of belief, actually, it's coming. There may be artificial intelligences which make demands of citizenship upon us. And I don't think that is a bizarre or science fictional thought. It's no different, logically speaking, from demands of citizenship that were made upon white men by black men and women and gays and other people who were not considered sufficiently normal to be part of the conversation. This is the essence of the democratic challenge. It's not just continuing the conversation with everybody who happens to be here now, difficult though that may be. The real essence of continuing the game is that it has to be essentially open to otherness. And true civility, as distinct from politeness, which I believe is the essence of robust democratic discourse, a democratic virtue among others, but perhaps the most important one, is absolutely essential to that future of democratic progress. There, thank you very much.